and thank you for joining us today for this session where I'm joined by some panellists to discuss staff recruitment and retention. We're pleased to have so many of you joining us already, but while we're waiting for a few more to join, I'll cover some housekeeping points. Thanks. The session is being recorded and we'll be sharing any handouts, slides and a link after the event, as we are with all of our sessions. The event is CPD accredited. If you would like a certificate, we need you to give your consent to share your data, and you can do that via the survey that will pop up as you leave the session. If you have any questions during the session, and we're really hoping for lots of Q&A for this session, please post them into the Q&A function and we'll endeavour to get to as many of them as possible. Finally, we'd like to thank the Institute of Engineering and Technology for sponsoring our event over the last 2 days. We're delighted that we've had their support. So hello and welcome to this lunchtime session where we will be discussing staff recruitment and retention and exploring whether it is the crisis of the education sector. My name is Hannah Stolten and I am the CEO here at Governance for Schools. I'm delighted to be joined here today by 2 experts at the moment, but hopefully we'll be joined by a third shortly, who will be sharing their experience and ideas on the topic. So at the moment we have Tony Breslin, who is author of Lessons from Lockdown and Bubble Schools. He's a governance expert, a trainer and a national leader of governance. We also have Niki Townson, who is head of recruitment operations at Teach First, a charity I'm sure you'll all be aware of. Teach First helps people develop into inspiring teachers and school leaders, supporting schools in the most deprived areas of the country to deliver the education that their pupils deserve. We're also hoping to be joined by Eamon Whelan, who is CEO at Yearwood Education, School and College Advisors. He's a non-executive director of eTeach as well. Hopefully Eamon will be able to join us shortly, but we'll make a start without him. As I said, during this session, I'd love to be able to share your questions with the panel, so please do use the Q&A function for the session. We'll get to as many questions as possible, and if we don't manage to get to your question, then we'll share answers after the session. We'd strongly recommend that you set your view to gallery view for this session, if it's not already showing that way, so that you can see all of the panellists at once. So to start us off, our webinar title implies we are facing a crisis of recruitment and retention in the education sector. So I'd like to hear from each of our panellists on whether they think that's accurate. So over to you first, Tony.
Well, I'm always a bit worried when we use the term crisis, as it were, unnecessarily or emotionally. I think there's maybe good reason to use that term at the moment in other areas of public life. But actually, as long as I've been involved in education, the recruitment and retention of high quality staff has never been easy. But what we have had is periods of relative success and relative failures. And we've had fantastic innovations, of which Teach First is a key one. But also what we now have is a richer range of routes into teaching. I know beyond the PGCE route and Teach First. And I know that to some that's controversial, and I know there are some concerns about whether that impacts on quality, but actually we do have more tracks into teaching. We have in the time of my career seen the emergence of the teaching assistant as a major player as well as teachers. But I think the key thing that we should be saying to policymakers generally is any education policy should be stress tested for its likely impact on teacher recruitment and teacher retention. And if the question is, or if the answer is rather, that this may cause people to either not join the profession or to leave the profession, then actually I would argue we shouldn't be going forward with that policy at this time. And I guess that applies locally to us on our own boards as well, to ask that question: will this help us attract, retain the best teachers? So nationally, policymakers need to ask that. Locally, in terms of local authorities and regional agencies, that needs to be asked. We need to ask it as a board. I can't help but feel that some of the stresses that the profession are under have been self-generated by, an over-focus. I'm not against accountability measures at all, but an over-focus on certain accountability measures. And maybe that has a negative impact. If we look, for instance, at the number of head teachers departing or planning to depart the profession at the moment, that's quite frightening. So let's maybe not use the term crisis, but let's use the concern to ask ourselves whether we're inadvertently at board level and whether our policymakers inadvertently or otherwise are doing anything to discourage people from joining and staying in this great profession. By the way, I'm a teacher by background, so I have a slight vested interest in saying that.
Thank you ever so much, Tony. Niki, what are your thoughts?
So I agree with Tony that the word crisis cannot be the most helpful. It is an emotive word. It's a fairly exaggerated word, but I do think that the other thing that he touched on is really important, and that is that there is definitely a significant challenge, and it's not a new one. And that means that there are years of kind of cumulative challenge in this area building up. So again, Tony's touched on some of the things that have emerged as almost responses to that challenge. So we do have additional tracks into teaching. We do have different roles within schools that can contribute to this. But at the same time, we've seen press this week that says that the DFE are 40% under their secondary ITT recruitment targets for this year. So even with all of these additional tracks, even with the other options out there, we're seeing a real shortfall in the number of people entering initial teacher training and entering the profession. And we've had a couple of relatively good years. Certainly we've experienced that at Teach First during the pandemic for teacher recruitment, but they aren't enough to counteract the years of undershooting that ran up to it. And certainly this year we're seeing that come back with a bit of a vengeance. So I think it is a real problem. I'm definitely closer to the recruitment end than I am to the retention end. I don't work directly with schools in my role. I work with candidates coming into teaching for the first time, but I guess my interaction is via the schools that our trainees go into. And again, certainly on a Teach First level, we had a record year for school vacancies coming to us this year, in a year where candidate demand has dropped off. So you're seeing that sort of imbalance between new teacher supply and school demand, and that's something that we've really felt this year.
Yeah, so that I guess is one of the biggest challenges. Are there any other big challenges to recruitment that you're seeing in your areas of work, Niki?
Yeah, so there are a few. Some I think will probably be quite familiar to everybody on this call. So Teach First are operating in a space where we're not necessarily competing with other routes into teaching for applicants. Some of our candidates will be weighing up Teach First versus PGCs versus some of those newer routes into teaching that we've talked about. But a lot of our applicants are also graduates who are looking at grad schemes, and they're looking at jobs in a range of sectors, and teaching is just one of the options that they're considering. And salary does play a huge part in weighing up those different options against each other. I know we've seen a 5% increase in teacher salaries announced for this year. That's an improvement, but it's still not necessarily keeping pace with inflation or with what other sectors can offer. That also only applies to qualified teachers. So for Teach First, our first year trainees are paid as unqualified teachers, and that salary hasn't moved nearly as much. So if you're looking as a graduate at different options in a time when cost of living is at such a high, the first year salary versus what something in the private sector could offer is a huge sort of consideration. We also see a lot of candidates really concerned about negative press around the profession and the stresses that teachers are under. They hear about retention issues, they hear about burnout. It's something that's often sort of top of the headlines, and something that candidates who are already weighing up whether this is the profession for them are really cognizant of. So that's something, it's hard to persuade people that teaching is going to be a magnificent thing to go into when all they're hearing is that teachers are on strike at the same time. And then there are a couple of things that I think are trends that have been around for a while, but are newer in terms of how much impact they're having. I guess tied to the press around workload and around burnout, we are seeing more and more candidates who talk a lot about mental health, who are concerned about the pressures of the Teach First programme or of any route into teaching, who are talking a lot about what that means in terms of their geographic flexibility as well. So Teach First are obviously very focused on working with schools where the need is greatest, and that means a lot of what we do is move people around for the programme. We see a challenge in recruiting into schools across the country, but it's much more pronounced in some areas than others. So we've definitely seen sort of less willingness from our market to be flexible because people are concerned about being near their networks, about having support, because they've heard a lot about the challenge they're going to face. And the other one, which I think again was on its way, but the pandemic has definitely heightened, is around flexibility. So I think applicants at graduate level now are expecting and demanding a measure of flexibility in how and when they work, in location. When people think about where they need to relocate to for work, it's not the same as it was 3 years ago. More and more companies are able to offer at least a measure of remote work. And teaching, obviously, there's very little you can do in that front. You sort of need to be where the pupils are. But teaching is a particularly inflexible profession, and that's something that I think we can only mitigate to a degree. We can talk, when we talk about retention, around how much flexibility we can offer in terms of working hours and what that does to people further on in their careers. But I think at the outset, we have to recognise that the demands of teaching in terms of working patterns and locations are something that are quite unlikely to go away, but they are something that's kind of another point for an applicant to weigh up when they're deciding whether to go into teaching at all.
Thank you. We've had a comment in the Q&A that maybe it's a challenge across public sector workforce in the broader view as well, and a lot of those challenges that you're mentioning are also in healthcare and other similar professions.
Yeah, and Teach First do have a number of sister charities that operate quite similar graduate schemes in other sectors. So Unlocked work with the prison service, Police Now work with the police force, Frontline work with social services. So it's something that we've definitely seen the challenges and the need for some sort of response to replicated across different public sector services.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to sorry, Tony, I was going to come to you. Yep.
I think also there's kind of issue about how we approach the kind of post-lockdown world, because what we know about big systems is that they only really change when they've had a major system shock. We've had a major system shock. So maybe we need to rethink some of the ways in which we do things. So yes, on the one hand, people are looking increasingly for a mix of home working and working on site, and in large part that's going to be extremely difficult with teaching. But that said, maybe there are auxiliary groups that we grow who are online tutors who support the work of the school. Maybe one of the things that particularly early career graduate workers are saying is that they actually don't always like the working at home thing, because they're not getting the induction, they're not working with loads of other young buzzy people like they used to if they went into the city, for instance, right? They're not getting that. Do we turn the fact that we work in incredibly lively, vigorous settings called schools, can we turn that into a plus? And sometimes do we inadvertently, in being very open and rightly so about the pressures that teachers face, do we sometimes put people off our own profession? Do we talk enough about the positives? That's pretty easy for me to say from my home office, I appreciate. But I'm in school every week, and the vigour and the energy of schools, I think, is something we undersell as being wonderful places to work. So I just wonder there. And the other thing that strikes me, I've at various points in my career, both at a local authority school improvement kind of level and in the classroom, I've had responsibility for various aspects of careers education. And for 30 years in careers education, we've been saying to young people, you won't have one career for life, you're likely to have 3 or 4, and that's a good thing. So, maybe we've got to get away from it. I think Teach First run this implicitly because of the way Teach First is designed, I think we've got to get with the fact that it's not a defeat if someone teaches for X number of years and then goes and does something else. In fact, it might be a negative to say, if you come into teaching, you've got to stay here for life, right? The whole notion of career has changed. And I think that's really difficult for the established professions that rightly require a lot of preparation. And it may be putting them at some disadvantage in that sense. So can we, you know, is it a matter of not just teach first, but maybe teach later? You know, do we get used to a more fluid workforce where not everybody starts at 22 or 23? And I think those are kind of questions we need to explore, and maybe rethinking how we do stuff in light of the last 3 years might cause us to, it might give us some of that flexibility. So what we know, for instance, is that online, there's a lot you can't do online that you can do in the room, but actually there's some stuff you can do on the online that's more effectively done online. Now, might that, and maybe I'm talking about particular examination courses or whatever, but might that allow a degree of flexibility with regard to somebody doing a mix of a 4-day timetable on site and a 1-day timetable virtually? It's, you know, I just think we've got to explore this stuff and not assume that we will always do schooling the way we've always done schooling.
Yeah, I think you're right. And interesting thinking to think about, you know, that those opportunities that are available. We've had a question from Chris around technology, actually, and what role it can play in creating a more flexible working environment. Is there anything more that you can think of that where you've seen technology playing a role in making teaching a more flexible profession? Niki, would you like to go first? Sorry.
So from a Teach First perspective, we've certainly shifted how we provide support and training to our trainees over the last 3 years. Again, it was one of those shifts that was coming, but happened a lot faster than originally anticipated in March of 2020. So we've certainly seen that open doors for a broader range of candidates. So as Tony said, like, it is worth thinking about, there are people who can offer a lot to the teaching profession who aren't the typical profile of a PGCE student. At Teach First now, about 40% of our intake come through our experienced hires teams and aren't straight out of university. We've been working on that market for quite a while now, a good sort of 7-8 years. But moving to online delivery of our training, online delivery of a lot of our support has made us much more accessible. So Teach First trainees undertake a summer institute before they start in school, which traditionally was a 6-week residential at a university, which very much felt like sort of the next step of being a student to the candidates we were bringing in when we first started 20 years ago. Now that training is by and large done online with an element of in-school time. And this year, for the first time, we operated a part-time version of it. So again, historically, people had to be available for 6 weeks of full-time training before they started a salaried position. That's opened a lot of doors for us. It's made us a much more viable option for people who want to train as a teacher, but who already have financial commitments, which mean that they can't have a window of time where they're unemployed, who need to be able to, you know, be at home and be on hand for whatever has to be done in that area of their life as well. And that continues throughout the programme. So we used to have quite a lot of in-person time in kind of regional hubs with Teach First staff to support subject knowledge, to go into university, to complete the academic qualification that they're doing. The vast majority of that is now delivered online as well. So while our teachers are still physically in school every day in term time, the additional responsibilities of the training programme don't require like further movement, are more easily slotted in around a life. Basically, they're easier to slot in around whatever else you have going on. And we definitely think in terms of accessibility, that's opened us up a lot. So that's a very training specific answer, but Tony might have some other ideas of what schools can offer.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the future isn't online or on site. It's a blend of the two. And it's a blend rather than a hybrid. Hybrid is where you try and clunkily kind of bring the two together. Blended for me is where they they interflow with each other. I'd like to see, for instance, the exploration. I'm sure some are already doing this, but I'd like to hope that within 3 or 4 years, every PGCE programme and equivalent programmes such as Teach First, you may already, have a very distinct element, module, which is all about the online, right? So that actually, maybe at the moment, typically, you might do 2 substantive teacher placements. Maybe you do 3 and they're slightly shorter, but one of them is completely online. So actually you master and become, we've got to get away from the idea that one approach is better than the other, because that just leads us to put the computers back in the cupboard. And I think that would be a real lost opportunity, because the digital literacy of the profession, and certainly of a group of people in every school, it's not everybody in every school, has gone through the roof. We need to harness that. You know, it was born out of the response to a very profound crisis, but that doesn't mean we throw it away when the crisis is dealt with. And if we focus on, you know, in terms of researching both lessons from lockdown and bubble schools, with the focus groups, and I engaged over 100 education professionals, parents, pupils in each, for the research for each. I always finished the focus group or interview discussions with the question, take yourself back to March 2020 and then ask yourself, what can't you wait to get back to? And what can't you wait to leave behind? And we have, because actually, if we just go back to normal, well, normal had problems in terms of teacher recruitment. Normal had problems in terms of achievement gaps, patterned by ethnicity and social class and a whole range of other things. So actually getting back to the old normal is not good enough, but actually trying to work as a profession, and we must play our part as governors in framing what teaching and what schools could and can be like as we move forward. Really interesting. For instance, sixth form consortia working. Sixth form teaching is often a vital attraction in secondary because it gives the individual some A-level teaching, right? So it's kind of, often a staff retention strategy. But we have problems with unsustainable sixth forms and small sixth forms and so on. Well, online could transform some of that, because we could have the expert sociology teachers and the expert maths teachers, etc., working across a group of schools in an area or a multi-academy trust. And suddenly the kids aren't always late for the lesson because they were on the bus, you know. So actually we need to think about where we can use the technology and where absolutely we shouldn't. And it's about working that out. And that then becomes a part of the attractiveness of our offer as a profession, you know, in the global sense, but also as an individual school, or as an individual multi-academy trust, or as a particular area. Because we're able to actually say, what does it mean to be a teacher in Brent? What does it mean to be a teacher in Hertfordshire? What does it mean to be a teacher in the Anthem Schools Trust, where I'm trustee, right? What does it mean to be a primary practitioner in this federation rather than that? And so that actually we get less generic, because people have more skills from which to build their professionalism. And I think building online capacity as we create teachers and not after we've made them for Chalk and Talk is one way to think about doing that. Thank you.
Niki, you mentioned the increase in teachers coming into teaching as a second profession, as a second career. Are there benefits that you've seen in terms of that demographic of people coming into teaching later?
Absolutely. So I'm slightly biased in it because my background within Teach First was in the experienced hires team as it started. So I've always been very much on that side of the fence as opposed to our campus recruiters. But I think we've seen huge advantages in just bringing people with a really diverse range of experiences into the classroom. In the end, if you have an education system where virtually everybody's gone school, university, PGCE school again, you have people with very few reference points outside of the education sector. And I think we can be guilty in education of doing things the way we've always done them, and having a lot of people who've been through exactly the same track to get where they are reinforces that. So certainly Teach First have seen a lot of our trainees go on into leadership positions. It's one of the sort of the attractive sides of the Teach First proposition, is that it is a program that sets you up to move into leadership relatively quickly. Our career changes do that faster. We have people coming from an incredibly broad range of backgrounds. So you have people who have been working as TAs for a long time, who've maybe done an OU degree to become qualified to do a postgraduate teaching qualification, who then come into the system, and what they bring is years and years of classroom experience, often training in the school that they've always worked at. So they bring that sort of community tie. They're really valuable, and they hit the ground running incredibly quickly as trainees because they're already there. But then you'll have people who might have been a lawyer for the last 30 years and last set foot in a school when they were at one, and they bring something very different. And I think they bring something very different to their pupils, in that they're able to offer insight into other fields. They're able to talk about life experience that the typical teacher by the old-fashioned profile mightn't have been able to offer. But they're also really valuable to the school as sort of in a managerial capacity almost. So they're able to bring attitudes and innovations from other sectors into the school environment and see, again, where you can apply something different and where you shouldn't, and the way the education sector does things exists for a reason. So yeah, I think generally more variation in the viewpoints of school staff is always going to lead to sort of better practice going forward and more opportunity to identify more opportunities. Yeah, I think it's something that we've definitely seen add value. It is a challenge in that, again, we talk about the need to diversify routes into teaching, to diversify how we do things, to look at how we make things more flexible. The traditional Teach First program of you do a 6-week residential and then we relocate you to Grimsby and that's where you live for the next 2 years is a little bit more difficult if you have 3 children and a mortgage. But we've certainly found we've needed to flex our approach, and that's allowed us to bring a real wealth of experience into our schools.
Sure. How do we encourage those people to come into the profession, Tony?
Well, I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about this is, I know this sounds like professional poaching from other professions, and certainly I used to lead the Citizenship Foundation, and we ran the mock trial competitions, and I had 2 examples of teachers who left the profession to become lawyers as a result, which wasn't the intention. But one of the things that I think is worth seriously thinking about is where might we recruit great teachers from? At the Federation where I'm a chair, I was in this morning, we have a fantastic colleague in his second year of teaching who had built up a very successful legal practice and just kind of, I guess, hit one of those landmark birthdays and thought, you know, I want to do something else. And you know, I won't name or embarrass, but he's been a revelation, and teaching has been a revelation to him. So certainly there are people out there with skill sets we can utilize. And if we think about the professional diversity of our own governing boards, it's one of their great strengths. Nobody says to Tesco, you've got too many retailers on your board, or nobody says to NatWest, you've got too many bankers on your board, but they have. And one of the things that we have, I think, in school governance, there are fewer governance scandals and all the rest of it, you know, in spite of it being the unpaid one. The reality is that we bring a diversity of people with empathy for education into the system, and they bring an enormous range of skills. And we also on that board make sure that we have teachers and educationalists as well, and parents as key users of what we provide as well. Now, I just think we've probably got to be just as imaginative about how we attract people into the teaching profession. And, you know, I like people to stay a little bit longer than the Teach First 2 years, and many of them do, and they contribute an awful lot. But what about if we kind of had a model that didn't, at the moment, we give ourselves the crisis and the word crisis because we assume it's an enormous defeat for the profession if somebody, having taught for 7 or 8 years, decides to do something else at 30. Well, actually, that might be a success in some senses. They may have given us some fantastic years. They have developed a whole range of skills. They may go off and do something else. Wherever else they sit in the system, they'll have a greater empathy for teaching and the profession. And don't we want the narrative that they're talking about? It's not one of them leaving because of burnout, but actually because they wanted to do something else, and teaching had given them fantastic skills to do so. So I just kind of think that there is something around that, but let's be imaginative, more imaginative maybe, about who we recruit and where we recruit from. You know, the greater range of routes of access should be a strength within that.
I'd just like to say they also go on to make great governors, because we have so many ex-Teach Firsters as part of the cohort that we place as governors. We sort of touched on diversity there. We've got a diversity specific question around increasing representation of Black, Asian and ethnic minority teachers, that there's significant issues in certain areas of the country. Wales in particular has also been added. What are your recommendations to combat that? Niki, do you want to go first?
Sure. So this is a real area of focus for us. So Teach First has slightly higher representation of AME teachers within our cohorts than the profession does as a whole, but we are still a long way shy of the targets that we're aiming for in this. I think it's been really interesting as we've gotten more focused to see what the barriers can be. So again, because the Teach First model works on recruiting people with the potential to be great teachers and then matching them with the school to work in, and that involves quite a lot of moving people around, looking at what makes a good match between trainee and school has been a really interesting one, because there are obvious upsides to placing teachers in schools where they reflect the communities they serve. There are obviously advantages in giving pupils role models who look like them, allowing them to see people in professional positions who come from the same background as them. And when we think about post Teach First programme retention, there's a lot to be said for placing people in communities they have strong ties to in terms of the likelihood of them wanting to stay there in the longer term. There's also a huge amount to be said for giving schools that might be in enormously and ethnically diverse areas teachers from different backgrounds. We've talked a lot about diversity of perspective and the value that can bring, and that can be huge as well. But one of the things that we, as a teacher training provider, have to really think about is quality of the training experience and how suitable a working environment is for trainees. So we've had challenges in the past where we've placed Black or Asian trainees in a school in a predominantly white area with a predominantly white staff, and it hasn't been the most inclusive or welcoming training environment, and it has had an impact on that trainee's experience and potentially on their sort of willingness to continue in teaching after the 2-year programme. So I think we have to think about making schools genuinely inclusive and welcoming workplaces, and we have to think about what that means. And again, because we work across the country, we see huge variation in the level of knowledge that the schools that we work with have on what that could entail. There are certain accommodations that we might need for sort of religious practice that partner schools we work with in London are completely au fait with, happy to do, know exactly how to do it. And some of our other partner schools may be very willing, but need quite a lot of coaching just to understand what it means. And I think if we're serious about making the education sector more diverse and having that sort of breadth of representation on school staffs, both in areas with large ethnic minority populations and areas without, where it can broaden perspectives, we do need to make sure that the schools as a working and training environment are geared up to do that and are given the support they need to be able to make it a genuinely welcoming workplace.
Sure, thank you. Tony, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that, you know, ultimately this goes back to most people in teaching. I think the greatest strength of teaching is arguably also its greatest weakness. And that is that most of us who are in it or have been in it are in it because we had a great education, or we loved our education, or we loved school, or we had, you know, in my case, it was my father, we had a very particular kind of role model. If young people from working class backgrounds, from BME backgrounds, are experiencing school more negatively, then fewer of them ultimately are likely to want to choose. Teaching is a much less obvious career choice as a result. And I think one of the kind of questions we have to ask, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's worth exploring. How do we attract into teaching people who might be exceptional teachers and have all the qualities, but actually who didn't much like school? Because if we could get them in, I think we'd get some people in who might want to change the system a bit, might want to shake it up a bit, and might bring incredible creativity to it. Because actually what we really have to deal with is those long-standing gaps, attainment and achievement level. You know, I mean, COVID didn't cause any of this. It exposed it and it might have deepened it, but it made visible some of these issues. And actually, the long-term route, of course, we've got to be more innovative in terms of where we advertise, where we search, how we promote, all of that stuff, right? We have to do all of that. But ultimately, in a deeply kind of structural sense, if we want more BME students, if we want more trainees from white working class backgrounds and so forth, we have to change the educational experience of those children now to increase the likelihood of them being teachers in the future. And I guess one of the virtues of meeting as a group of school governors today is that actually just possibly we can do something about that on our own patch, in our own school, in our own MAT, in our own local authority, because we can, you know, take that wonderful question. I'm not known as a great champion of the inspectorate always, although I think inspection is vital. But, you know, to take that terrific question at the heart of the new framework, what's it like to be a child in this school? Now, whether it's been brought to us by the inspectorate or whoever, I think that's a great question for every school leader, every school teacher, every school meal assistant to have front and centre of their mind. And if we're asking that question, and if we're then drilling it down to what's it like to be a black student at this school? What's it like to be a student from a working class background at this school? What's it like to be a student with a terrific talent for the piano at this school? If we begin to think about that, we might get closer to closing those gaps. And if we close those gaps, we'll get more of those young people aspiring to be teachers. Because you know what? Teachers help change their lives, and schools did, and they'll come back.
That's a really good point. We often see people, when they apply to be a governor, they put in their personal statement that they either had a great experience at school or had a really not great negative experience at school, and that's what's motivating them to take up the role. So it's just that next step to get the people into the teaching profession for the same reasons.
Yeah.
Moving on to retention, we've had a question around wellbeing, which I know you touched on, Niki, at the beginning. How can governing boards deal with wellbeing concerns which might affect retention of school leaders without greater burdens being passed on to other staff members? So this was also raised at our wellbeing session right at the start of the conference. So the sort of balancing act of making sure that all staff wellbeing is being looked after. Tony, did you want to go first on that one?
Yeah. I think what we've got to remember is, first of all, as governors, one of our key responsibilities is the support of the head. And I get rather irritated by that number 2 of the 3 functions of governance in the governance handbook, because it says hold the head teacher to account. Ethically, morally, you can't hold somebody to account unless you've done everything in your power to give them all the support they need to succeed in the role. So I think that what we need to do is to think about, and we've in some ways there's been some terrific practices come out of this during lockdown, but we need to think about how do we support the head, because that is one, especially the chairs amongst us, but the board as a whole. How do we support our school leaders? Because if we don't support our heads, they won't be able to support their staff. And if they're not able to support their staff, the staff won't be able to support the children. So there's this kind of well-being font that if we don't look after our leaders, nobody else gets looked after either. So, you know, we do have a greater focus in the inspection framework on things like staff well-being now. We ought to take those levers. I wasn't convinced when the inspectorate continued to inspect in England through the COVID term last autumn term, when schools were really struggling, that was the best demonstration of a commitment to well-being. But I do believe that is coming through the system now. And it's a legal requirement, it's a duty of care. So I think, you know, this isn't saying don't worry about the attainment, don't worry about the targets. It's saying do both. And it might be saying that if we work better at the well-being, some of the issues around retention might sort themselves. If we do better around inclusion, some of the issues around attainment might sort themselves. And I think sometimes we think of well-being and inclusion as a nice to have that you do afterwards. And that means that the people who most need the support, whether they're members of our staff or a particular school leader at a particular point in their life, or our children, if we always put, you know, the attainment stuff and the hard targets first, ironically, they might become harder to reach. But the smarter way to meet the smart target might be to start with ensuring that the well-being and the inclusion stuff is there, and that inclusion is not a porta cabin at the bottom of the yard that people get sent to.
Thank you. I'll just signpost at this point our Wellbeing Governors report, which we launched yesterday, so that's all available on our website. Niki, did you want to add anything on wellbeing?
Yeah, I think there was a point in the Q&A around sharing of resources and why we need to sort of reinvent the wheel so often in individual schools teaching to the same curriculums. And I think this is another area where technology can actually help us to alleviate some of the burden on teachers. So it's sort of, originally it was kind of an accidental side effect of the Teach First sort of cohort approach, that we saw a lot of resources making their way between schools over the years. We had an awful lot of trainees house sharing with other people on the programme, teaching in other schools, doing the same subject. And what you saw was, if one school had a great set of lesson plans on something, it worked its way around that region's cohort quite quickly. I think we have the sort of machinery now to be able to do that on a greater scale. We've seen things like Oak National Academy emerge during the pandemic. There is a lot of work that exists that's really important, but that doesn't need to be done every time, and that we can offer teachers sort of the networks they need to be able to share resources, whether that's formally through something that is like Oak, that's developing a bank of like nationally available material, or whether it's informal networks where teachers are just sharing best practice with others who teach in the region or not. You know, if you're teaching to the same curriculum, it doesn't really matter whether it's a Zoom call on the other end of the country. But I think we can open some doors there. We have a heads network, which I think has provided some sort of functional use, but also in terms of head teacher well-being, giving heads space to talk to each other and to offer that kind of emotional well-being support and speak to others in the same situation as them, because they within a school are fairly isolated in their position of responsibility. Is another way that networks can actually open up doors to sort of offering support that maybe wasn't there when schools were operating more discreetly. So I think it's something that we should look at, is where are we duplicating work across the sector? Where are we leaving people to struggle with the same problems and the same challenges in isolation, when they could actually be looking at it through the lens of what a group of people in exactly the same position have done, sharing best practice and just knowing that they're not on their own with it. I think making sure we make the most of the opportunity to bring people together, whether that's virtually or in person, is really important.
Anna, I think also that you mentioned that I think it was something like 2,700 people have registered for this conference, and that about thirds of those will connect, and the other third will get the materials and view them some other time. That would have been unheard of. You know, 3-4 years ago, people believed firmly that a conference had to be in a hall probably a windowless one in the basement of a hotel. There are real advantages. Coffee on tap to this way of working. So let's connect teachers in that way. And also, I think people have, some people have reservations. I entirely understand about aspects of the academisation agenda and all the rest of it. But what it has begun to do formally is really put schools into groups. So are we sharing knowledge across our group? And in fact, one teacher retention, I went to visit, I don't know if they're in the room, the schools of the Maritime Education Trust about 4 or 5 years ago down in Greenwich, when I was researching the RSA report, Who Governs Our Schools, which I'd been commissioned to write. Yeah. And they at the time had 3 schools in the group, and the 3 schools had very different school cultures because they had emerged in very specific locations, and those cultures were important to those individual schools. And what they had was a real focus on 3 or 4 key things, and more or less the notion that, you know, provided it's ethical and legal and principled, we don't mind how you get there, use your freedom, use your expertise, do it your way. The interesting thing, therefore, was that you could go and teach in one of their schools and you could do 2 or 3 years there, and then you might apply to a job in another of their schools, and then you might apply to a job in another. And the interesting thing was that the 3 schools were very distinct, and so you got the experience, but the trust held on to the expertise. Sure. So just thinking about how we use the kind of new networks of school organisation to, you know, whether it's federations, multi-academy trusts, etc. We're a federation of an infant school and a junior school, serving the same children. We used to lose teachers from the junior school who wanted infant experience and lose teachers from the infant who wanted junior. Now, we have teachers going up and down the system. We have some who teach on both sites. We retain people for longer. They enjoy their job more. I'm pretty sure. Right? I better check the wellbeing survey. But my point is that let's be innovative about how we think about this, and online gatherings, and also the kind of new groupings of schools that are emerging, I think offer us a lot there.
I think that's really interesting. We in the academisation session yesterday, there was obviously some questions around teachers being forced to work in another school and whether that was a negative thing, but actually turning it on its head as this is professional development for you, and actually it may be an experience that you're looking for, but a way to retain great teachers. Then it's in all of
our advertising materials at the Federation, we say that you're likely to be based in, or this vacancy is at the junior school, but we're confident we can provide you with opportunities to work in, and I think that's an attraction. And I think, look, we can present all of these things in the negative, and I think we need to think about the negative.
Sure.
I think sometimes as a profession we overstress that.
Yep.
Because actually there are other people who are knackered after work as well. You know, and I wouldn't swap for a construction site any day of the week. So, you know, there is a kind of positivity thing that we just need to hold on to a little bit.
Thank you. And I just put an interesting comment which really resonates with me. From staff surveys, one of the retention issues we have as a small school, we've got 4 or 5 teachers, is the additional workload from subject leadership. Our school's a lot bigger, 10 form, 10 classes, but yeah, again, additional workload from subject leadership, since basically everyone ends up with 1 or more subjects to lead on top of everything else. Any suggestions you have to help with this? Nikki, anything that you'd like to add there?
I think this is one where I'd refer back to what we've just been talking about, actually. I think this is a prime example of where we need to reduce duplication in work and group schools together and group school staff together to make sure that we're not, I mean, you'll have dozens of schools of that size with 4 to 5 members of staff buckling under the weight of multiple subject specialisms. can you partner up if a school is within, obviously if you're within a multi-academy trust, there's a very obvious way of doing it, which is only have one subject leader per mat as opposed to per school. But do we need to establish networks which allow schools who aren't actually formally within the same management structure to do this as well? Because again, I mean, it's a challenge of the primary curriculum. It's very broad. We're always going to have it in those very small. Teach First have started working more with rural primary schools. And you have the challenges of multi-form entry as well as the size of staff to the breadth of curriculum ratio. But I think a lot of this is about how do we forge those connections and avoid doing everything twice.
Sure. How can governors support in that area, Tony? Thinking about from a governor perspective, I mean, you might have linked governors for different areas. Is there something that we can do as governors to support?
Well, I think we should encourage at every stage connection with colleagues in other schools. When I was researching bubble schools, I fell upon really colleagues in Northern Ireland. I don't know if we have any in the room, but where they have area learning councils. I think that's the right title, which bring groups of teachers together. And Alistair Hamill, who does a lot in work in this field, there is at Lurgan College and passionate geographer. But you know, he brings together teachers across the area. They've necessarily met online quite a bit of the time. They share their resources, and it becomes a less isolated task. I don't really think, I might get shot for this, but having the additional thing of subject leadership, say in history, right, in a primary school, I'm not so sure that it's really about the extra workload, because you've always got to prepare for that history session or whatever. It's about the additional responsibility. It's about the burden of it being on your shoulders and being on you if it doesn't show up great in results or at inspection or whatever. And here, of course, is where linked governors can be absolutely vital. And it seems to me that I always say to, you know, in terms of linked governorship, turn your linked governors inside out. Instead of saying, oh, great, we've got an accountant on the board now. I plead guilty on this one, by the way, but we've weaned ourselves off it. You can take care of finance for us, because that's not good governance, right? Instead, when you get an accountant on the board, you say, teach the rest of us about finance, raise our financial literacy. Well, likewise, don't leave geography or maths or English on a linked governor, right? Get that linked governor to educate us about that link area through the relationship that they build with the subject leader or leaders in the area. And let's make those visits about intelligence gathering. We've got people who do the inspection stuff. We've got local school improvement partners and all the rest of it. We're not going in to do, we're not another individual coming in to monitor and do standards, right? Yeah. What we're doing is curiously engaging in how our school does what it does and why it does what it does. And I think that, you know, in a sense, if that history teacher or geography teacher knows that that linked governor is going to go back with that wonderful example of work and share it with the board, go back with that real worry about resourcing and you know, through the appropriate line management stuff, the head and all the rest of it. But again, they are giving voice to that isolated individual, and the work feels heaviest because of the isolation. So if we can deal with the isolation, and if we can, you know, switch to that mode of really being supportive and connecting as governors, then I think we can make some progress.
Lovely, thank you. Another question, what should governors look for when working with recruitment organisations? So Niki, I know you had some thoughts on this before when we were talking before.
Yeah, so I think this is one where I think governors can play quite a large part. So I think there are a few things that I would want a board of governors to be aware of, and one is just around knowing what your options are. So again, obviously I'm specialised in initial teacher training. There are, as we've already touched on quite a few times, a range of ways that people can come into the teaching profession now, and depending on where you are and where your school is, the options available to you would differ. So I think one area is that I think governors should be really familiar with the landscape of training routes in their area, know what opportunities schools could be looking to engage with. I think what's really important as well, though, is understanding what the requirements the different recruitment routes have of the school are, and how appropriate they're going to be for that school environment. So one of the things Teach First have to think about, in addition to, is the school in the right place for this trainee, is this going to be the right training environment? We've talked about schools offering inclusive workplaces to trainees of different backgrounds. There are definitely things that we have to consider if you're taking on a trainee through the Teach First model. You're bringing in a full-time member of staff who's not supernumerary, who has their own classes, but who is brand new to teaching. So there's a mentorship requirement there. You need to have sufficient support within the rest of the department to help that teacher to find their feet and to really offer something to the school. I'd always be very wary of organisations, particularly training-based organisations, that don't have many demands of the school as an environment. They should be asking questions of you as much as you should be asking questions of them. So I'd want to see that, and that level of sort of due diligence on the provider's behalf before anything sort of proceeded. When you're working with recruitment providers who aren't also providing training, so recruitment agencies who are providing experienced teaching staff and are just there on sort of a commission-based headhunting basis, I think one of the things that's really important to know is how they are representing your school and your school's opportunities in the market. So I work for Teach First now. I've worked in recruitment in agency environments in the past, not in the education sector, but that there are some pretty unscrupulous practices out there to be aware of. And I think whenever you sort of authorise any recruitment agency to speak to candidates on your behalf, you're authorising them to be your face in the market. Teachers talk. Teaching is a closely networked profession. And if someone is out there representing your school in a way you wouldn't want them to, or inaccurately, whether that's that they're painting too dismal a picture or too rosy a picture, and then people are getting to interview, finding out what the school's really like, and finding out that some of the stuff they've been led to expect isn't there, that gets around and that impacts your chances of hiring going forward. So I think really getting to know who's out there and really sort of finding out what kind of quality you can expect, quizzing on how they're going to represent you, is really important.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes. So I'm going to ask each of you, where next for recruitment and retention? What do you want to see happening over the next 12 to 24 months? Tony first, quick as you can though.
Right. I want to see, as I said right at the beginning, any education policy from any education minister. I want to see it stress tested in terms of its likely impact on teacher recruitment and retention. And if it is judged that it might be negative, right now we park it. So that actually any education policy has to be a recruitment and a retention policy as well.
Thank you. Niki?
So I'm going to pick on something that somebody's mentioned in the Q&A. So one thing that I think is a tangible change that could happen that I'd love to see is schools rethinking the ideal candidate. So this is something that Teach First have found quite challenging in the last few years, because when Teach First started, there was a very definite profile for the typical recruit. They were 21 or 22 years old. They had straight A's in their A levels and they'd been to a Russell Group uni. And that was how we began. Over the years, as we've gotten more expert in selecting based on teaching potential, we've seen a more diverse range of candidates come through. And that means that on paper, some of the trainees, there's still plenty who come from that traditional background, but some of the trainees that we are offering to schools mightn't have the academic record that a school is typically associated with a Teach First candidate. We've done a lot of due diligence in our selection process to know that they are people that we are really confident could be great teachers. There is a reluctance on quite a lot of schools' parts to take that leap of faith at this point. And I think schools need to think really carefully about what they need to do to bring in more teachers, more diverse teachers, and what that means they might need to compromise on in their traditional view of the perfect candidate.
Thank you ever so much. And that takes us exactly to 1 o'clock. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us today. It was a really insightful session, and still lots of questions which we will come to in the chat. Thank you ever so much to everybody for participating, and we hope that you enjoyed the session. We do have a few more sessions left this afternoon, so hope to see some of you at those sessions today. If you do have any questions, please do get in touch. We are available on governorsforschools.org.uk and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.